Joel Freeman is no stranger to 100 Huntley Street. The Alberta native is a former pastor of 18 years, the author of several books. Let me just name a few. God is Not Fair, Living with Your Conscience Without Going Crazy, If Nobody Loves You, Create a Demand. Not a romance book, we'll discover. He also inspired the Christian Business Directory, The Shepherd's Guide. Joel holds a Master of Science degree, a Ph.D. in psychology, and he's the president of the Freeman Institute in Baltimore, Maryland, where he lives with his wife, Shirley. I think you kicked the 4 kids out, Joel, didn't you? They're all...
We got the empty nest syndrome going on in our house, almost.
Now, we mentioned this book. You've been here talking about If Nobody Loves You, Create the Demand. That's a very interesting title. This is about entrepreneurship.
It is, and I am so passionate about this book because I'm getting emails and phone calls and people telling me that they have had business ideas, an invention or something like that to take to the marketplace, and
now
this has been brought them into a kind of a creative zone.
You said passion, but I said to you, who's running the ship at home? Because you have gone down a track in this whole area of Black history that it feels to me as if you are pouring yourself out for this, and it's really quite astounding for a little guy from Three Hills, Alberta. What's this all about? How has this come about?
Well, what happened is I started working with the NBA Washington Bullets, the Wizards, back in 1979. And you can imagine at that time I was, from my understanding, was the second chaplain in the history of the NBA. And so the guys like you have Wes Unseld and Bob Lanier, who had the biggest feet in basketball, size 23, Julius Erving, and a bunch of other guys. You know, they were looking at me and just, I'm sure they're saying, I'm supposed to pour my heart out to that guy? You got to be kidding me. And so in their own way, they began to test me with questions like, where was the Garden of Eden? What part did Africans play in biblical history and extra-biblical history? And those were things that weren't even a blip on my radar screen. And so it forced me to start studying, but it wasn't until I met Don Griffin back in 1993. I was doing some leadership work for his company, a program called Dealing with People Who Drive You Crazy. And between sessions, Don began to share with me his journey as an African American in this whole topic, and his excitement, his passion, which got something happened inside of me. Don helped to fill in the gaps, to complete some things. And then I began to do more research, and I challenged him to write a book, and then he and his wife prayed and thought about it and said, you know, it'd be powerful to have a white man and a black man doing this together. And
really, he did the first half of the book. Am I right? And you did the second half.
That's right.
And the book is Return to Glory.
Yes, subtitled The Powerful Stirring of the Black Man.
Stirring of a Black Man. Well, it certainly has stirred a white man first, and I have to, I don't know what words to use. I felt like weeping, and I felt angry, and I felt grief and excitement. I mean, in ancient times, Black people were in world domination. How many people of African descent know that this is their heritage?
You know, sometimes I think when we talk about Black history, it seems to start at slavery. And one of my passions, along with many other people in this particular area, is to provide a context for these different things that have happened, some very horrific situations that have happened in the Black experience. And to be able to talk about some of the ancient creativity, the inventiveness, the perseverance, and to then paint a picture that you know, slavery, it happened, but wasn't the beginning of history. And so, and then to tie it into the Bible, because many times the word on the street is the Bible's the white man's book, that King Jimmy got a bunch of white guys to massage the text to further subjugate and dominate people of color. And in some ways, the Bible was used to justify the slave trade and to justify slavery, where people would, slaveholders would be going to church Sunday morning, and then they'd beat their slaves in the afternoon, saying, servants, obey your masters. And so there's just that's a terrible chapter of history and a terrible misuse of the Scripture. And so somehow to bring that back and say, you know that Tarharka is a biblical character? He's mentioned in Isaiah 37, 2 Kings 19. Here's a picture of him, by the way. And here's what he looked like. And he's definitely a man of African descent.
Is he the one that helped doing Sennacherib?
Yes, yeah, he's the one that Hezekiah called for to help.
Some of the facts that I gleaned from this were really, really heartbreaking. In the same way that we prayerfully discern when should we talk to our kids about the birds and the bees, people of African descent have to have the racism talk with their children. You mentioned that African men work African American men, I'm sure it's not different here, work 2 to 3 times harder, women 8 to 10 times harder, just to be accepted as average.
Yes. Yeah, I was with a couple some years back, and we were in their living room looking through the large pane window in the backyard, and their young son, 3 years of age, was running around the backyard and just showing off and having a lot of fun. And suddenly she turned to me and she says, "You know, Joel, about 10 years from now, people will be afraid of him." And you could have knocked me over with a feather. It was the first time, because here, you know, my wife and I, our thought is, top of mind issue is how do we bring up the birds and the bees with our kids? But that is not only the main issue, or there's an additional burden for people of African descent, for couples, for parents. And it's how do I bring up the topic of racism and prejudice and bigotry and narrow-mindedness without reinforcing the glass ceiling or the lead ceiling? And how do I do it in such a way, how do we do it in such a way that we're not coming across, we're bringing our own pain into the picture, and that it becomes a generational transfer of our pain to our children.
There's already been such an incredible response to the journey you've been taking, from Bill Cosby to Tony Campolo. What did Tony say? It's going to be hard for some people to face up to the truth. What's the most difficult truth, or the most surprising truth you've unpacked in your journey?
I think that the biggest thing, and by the way, I just want to say that I want to be truth-centric about this. I'm thankful for Afrocentrism and Eurocentrism, and there's some wonderful research that's been done on both sides of the coin. But the term that we want to use is truth-centric, because there's wacky stuff on both sides of the coin also. The biggest truth, I think, was the whole idea of welding together the grieving process with racism and prejudice. When I talked with African American men, they were looking at me like, you know, there's a suspicion scale from somewhat to extremely suspicious. We're banging on this end of the scale, the extremely suspicious end of the scale. And so to have a 65-year-old man look at me and say, "You're doing what, son? You're writing a book?" You know, I mean no disrespect, but I got to go around the corner and laugh a little bit, and then I'll come back and give you your 45 minutes. I asked a question that changed the tone of every single interview, and here it is. Do you remember the moment when you realized that because of the color of your skin that the rules were somehow different for you? Big pause, a sigh, and then with brilliant clarity telling me what happened when he was 5 or 6 years of age. That's the biggest truth I learned from this, and I'm learning from this, is that there's this weight of skin color. And it's very sad just to think that just because of the skin color, that this weight comes with it in terms of schooling, work, friends, how a person, you know, if they scowl too much, you know, come on, smile. What's going on? All kinds of issues that people go through in this area, and that to me, welding the grieving process. When was that moment? And then looking at the denial. You mean they hate me just because of the color of my skin? How does a 5 or 6 year old child wrap his or her arms emotionally, spiritually, mentally around that particular issue? And then to have the anger, the bargaining. Maybe when I get my MBA, maybe when I get my Ph.D., then things will change. And arriving, I call it destination sickness. When you arrive at that destination realizing that things are worse than I originally thought.
I want to mention that you've had black mentors.
Yes.
And you have wept with these men as you've probed their hearts. And we're about to meet one of the many wonderful African Americans on this video, who is Dr. Ben Carson.
Yes.
Tell us what he's famous for.
Dr. Ben Carson, he was the very first neurosurgeon, or any surgeon, to separate Siamese twins. Now, the scalpel slipping one way or the other, one of the twins is going to die. And he conducted the very first separation. And he has written a book about thinking big, and just what a story. I mean, he was considered a class dummy. Something changed in his mindset in fifth grade, and he went on to begin to study. His mom never finished school. She made him read books, no television until he finished his homework. I've met her. She is a wonderful, remarkable person. And what we're about to see is, it was about 10:30 at night. He'd been in Washington, D.C. all day, and I just asked him a question about the inventiveness of African Americans, and he just started speaking, and I was blown away as I sat there in the same room as he spoke.